Sling and Things.
Sup, and welcome back to Sling and Things, where it is now time to review one of the most notorious flops in motion picture history, Heaven's Gate from 1980, which was directed by Michael Cimino, was produced by United Artists. There are quite a few versions of this film. If you watch the previous video, you'll recall that the first unreleased cut of Heaven's Gate was 5 hours and 25 minutes long, whereas the second recut theatrical version was less than half that length. The version that I saw and am reviewing today is the 216-minute digitally restored cut that was produced for the Criterion Collection with Michael Cimino's consent a few years before he died. It's as close to matching the original theatrical version as possible. And in case you don't feel like doing the math yourself, 216 minutes means that the version of Heaven's Gate that I watched was 3 hours and 36 minutes long, making it one of the longest films I've ever seen. The first thing that needs to be said about Heaven's Gate is that for all the infamy associated with it, for all the chaos it caused, it's not that bad. Like, if you read Final Cut, you might get the impression that this is one of the worst assembled movies of all time, like it's a contender for worst movie ever, but it's not that. In fact, there are parts of Heaven's Gate that are wonderful. The problem is that the movie isn't really a movie at times. Heaven's Gate is like 70% movie and 30% historical reenactment. It's as though Michael Cimino wanted to show what old vacation footage of the Old West would look like if it existed. And so there are these long, loving travelogue parts to the movie that slow it down considerably. Slow it to the point that this movie is likely impenetrable to a lot of people. It's 3.5 hours long, and it's a slow 3.5 hours, with many scenes going on much longer than they needed to. For instance, the first part of the movie is a prologue featuring a couple of the main characters graduating from Harvard. And you watch these students dance and sing and celebrate and behave in a joyous way for 20 minutes. This is how the movie begins. And then the rest of the movie, which is set in Wyoming, picks up, and you find that the prologue has like nothing to do with it. The film begins with an uninterrupted 20-minute scene that is totally expendable. And Heaven's Gate is chock full of scenes like that, where the camera focuses on what the background extras are up to the whole time, or where it takes like 5 minutes for something to develop, or where it sticks on some routine even though it's not necessary. This movie has an enormous amount of padding, and what's funny about the film is that it wouldn't be that difficult to carve the runtime down to like 2 hours if you just wanted to focus on the story. But the catch-22 is that if you wanted to get the most out of this film, you couldn't edit it that tightly because the story isn't actually the selling point to Heaven's Gate. The scenery is the selling point. Say what you will about this film, but you cannot dispute that it is beautiful. Heaven's Gate features scene after scene after scene with some of the most gorgeous looking backgrounds you can imagine. Every shot in this movie radiates with detail and affection. This was an extremely expensive movie, and there's never an instance where you doubt where that money went. And that's true even when it transitions to the industrial settings, to the cities of the Old West, which feel alive and populated and moving. And the scenes progress very naturally, like they would in real life. At one point, there's a scene where we see some of the characters skating at a roller rink, and you watch these people dance and skate for 8 minutes. It's a scene that's not really there to advance the plot as much as it's there to give an authentic, voyeuristic peek into what life was like back then. This movie is devoted to aesthetic world building almost as much as it's devoted to its story. And that is why this movie kinda has to be really, really long. Because yeah, you could trim this down to 2 hours if you really wanted to, but then you'd be removing so much of what makes Heaven's Gate appealing, since some of the best eye candy in the movie are those scenes that aren't really there for the story. The irony, of course, is that Heaven's Gate wouldn't need to be so long and wouldn't need to be so dependent on those inessential scenes with wonderful backdrops, if the core of the movie, the story, was good enough to stand on its own. But it isn't. Heaven's Gate, the movie part of the movie, is uneven, and you get the sense from watching it that Michael Cimino didn't put nearly as much attention into the story that he did into the landscapes. The story is based on a Western range dispute. It's in the ballpark of Dances with Wolves. It focuses on a love triangle between two men and one woman, with the two men representing different sides of the dispute. And where the movie falters is that it doesn't do a good enough job of explaining who these guys are and what their motivations are and what their connection specifically is to this range war and what the backdrop to the range war even is. The bad guys in this movie more or less set out to commit genocide against the townspeople of Johnson County, Wyoming, and it never really clicks why they're going to such an extreme to deal with their territory issues. Like, the bad guys in this movie are so evil, they're such sociopaths, and yet their objective never seems proportional to their endgame. Like, they go from being upset that cattle are being stolen to compiling a death list and setting out to murder 125 people. That's a pretty big leap, and because the film starts with the bad guys wanting to kill those people, you're never really given enough reason to buy their rationale, other than accepting that, well, they're just evil. On the positive side, Heaven's Gate is very well performed, and even though it feels like it's missing some scenes at times that would tie it all together, it's still pretty enjoyable to watch some of these characters interact with each other, especially because it has a fantastic cast. It has Christopher Walken, Jeff Bridges, Isabelle Huppert, Sam Waterston. It even features the film debut of Terry O'Quinn. The standout, though, is Chris Christopherson, who plays the hero of the movie, Avril. Christopherson is terrific in this, and he carries a ton of screen presence considering that acting wasn't his original forte. Christopherson got famous by being a musician, and yet he was able, with not a lot of experience, to step into this role and be awesome at it. And unfortunately, this movie was such a bomb that it kinda derailed Christopherson's acting career, and he wound up getting far fewer roles in the coming years than he deserved. Which is a shame because, if nothing else, he was really good in this. There is definitely a select audience for Heaven's Gate, and if you watch it out of curiosity, you very well may come away liking it in spite of its reputation. However, the story gets in the way of its appeal at times. Heaven's Gate is very much for people who, don't mind watching screensavers, who like watching films for the artistry of it and all the beauty that comes with it. But in the story, there are a bunch of things that happen that aren't beautiful. There's a rape scene in this movie that didn't need to be in it. There are scenes where animals were harmed during the filming, and you watch them get harmed in the movie. Like, there's a cockfighting scene. There's a scene where a live horse gets blown up. The film also has a very bloody conclusion. Heaven's Gate ends with a Lord of the Rings type battle sequence between the townspeople and the bad guys that is pretty stunning in its execution, especially considering it doesn't utilize any CGI. But it is loud and violent, and if you do watch this movie for its relaxing scenery, you might be turned off by the 20-minute shootout that finishes it off. Which is a long way of saying that Heaven's Gate is a difficult movie to recommend, even with the caveat that I did enjoy a large part of it. I actually got into it more than I thought I would. If you like Westerns, and if you're willing to watch a movie specifically for its cinematography, then you too might get something out of this, because it has some positives going for it. It is a great looking film. And if you don't mind this film's runtime at all, then you might even love it. You might even regard this as a masterpiece, like some people do. But in order to watch this version of the movie, you have to set aside almost 4 hours of your life, and that's an awfully big commitment to watch a story that's pretty messy at times, and that doesn't do enough to justify its runtime. Heaven's Gate has flashes of brilliance, it has great acting, and it looks incredible, but it's so much work to get to those flashes, and they come so erratically that it's probably not worth seeing if you're a casual movie fan who needs a movie to be great in order to watch one that's this long. In other words, your mileage may vary, and you should have a pretty good sense by now whether or not you'd be into Heaven's Gate. It's not as great as it could have been, but it's also not as bad as the critics initially said it was. And if nothing else, it's an outstanding movie for a movie that brought down a film studio.